Welcome to Charts Today Energy. My name's David Linton, and today's edition for Tuesday, the 23rd of October, comes to you from London. Seeing more downside targets developing here on crude oil, and we see a sea of red, and that's been driven very much by sentiment globally. So we're seeing the dollar is up stronger. So we're seeing that dollar strength dominating, which is leading to a generally weaker euro, although we're up slightly this morning. We are still looking bearish short and medium term against the dollar. And sterling, we're seeing also back below that 130 level. So that's pretty key with downside targets to 126, 128. And against the euro, we're seeing sterling actually showing a little bit of strength this morning, but still bearish against the euro as well. The markets generally down. The stocks in the US last night reversing a lot of its gains. We're seeing the European future, the US futures down over 1%, 1.4% on the Nasdaq. European markets opening down significantly lower. The DAX down 1.6%, and also in Asia we're seeing some very big moves down. Hong Kong down 3%, Japan down about 3%, and China, one of our big worries, still lower as well. Gold is actually a beneficiary this morning on this, and we're seeing gold price moving above 1231 for the first time in a while, and just starting to move into bullish territory on that medium term. So we're seeing a climb in precious metals. Bonds fairly sedate this morning. We're seeing the Bund up slightly and yields down slightly as a result. Looking at the energy mix, looking at Brent crude, still looking very bullish on the long-term charts. And remembering this is my long-term weekly chart and my long-term targets, but medium-term the daily chart, and then shorter term we're seeing quite big falls. This is the 1 minute chart, so we're seeing what's happened in the last few hours, and we're seeing crude falling away here. These 1 minute targets for crude oil really fairly critical. We've got 78.40, 77.60, that's 2% lower, and 76.50. If we make a low below 79, we activate that 76.50 target, and the trends are down. So keeping it on these 1 minute charts on crude, pretty key. All this data, of course, coming from Thomson Reuters Icon. And if we look at WTI, we see here also moves lower this morning and activating a new downside target 67.60. So we are just seeing crude prices pushing lower generally, and the medium-term trend just coming under a little bit of pressure as well. US nat gas is falling now as well. This has held up pretty well of late, but we're seeing quite sharp falls away this morning. And if we again look at the 1 minute targets here, we see lots of downside targets: 311, 310, 306, 304 just activated. So it does look like we're going to come back into the low threes area. So quite key there. Needless to say, we're seeing heating oil and RBOB looking much the same as well. So we're seeing downside targets there. Coal actually down 1.2% this morning. So we're seeing that slight move down lower yesterday. Again, this is on Thomson Reuters Icon. If on the ICE contract, if you're running Trayport, you'll have your OTC data with more liquidity, and you'll probably have better downside targets. Keep an eye on that 1 minute chart for coal. 96.90 is the target that was given back at 98. That's where we're going. We still do have these upside targets, and they will be unwound respectively at 95.50 and 94. So keep an eye out for any unwinding of those targets and any new targets developing. Emissions, this is the ICE December contract, falling lower again this morning. We had downside targets yesterday. These have been exceeded and met. Looking at the correlations with crude oil here, we see fairly strongly correlated, so that fall away on crude is having a bit of an impact there. On the longer term chart, we do have now some downside targets, 1683 and one all the way down to 1074. That sounds fairly dire, but we have seen with emissions we can get big falls. And taking a look at the 1 minute chart, we've got a new downside target of 1795 if we break below this 1840 level. So keep an eye on that as well. Of course, the shorter term charts are going to be the places where we see the moves first. Looking at MBP, this is the ICE contract. So again, your OTC data on Trayport running into Updata, you might have a slightly different picture. We've got 67.60 as the downside target for MBP. We're seeing that fall away at the opening this morning, the gradual fall away that we saw yesterday. We've now got some medium-term targets on the 60-minute chart. We've got 69.60, 66.60, and 66.90. So we're seeing targets some 3% lower. Three targets pointing 3% lower. That's a cluster. That's increasing the likelihood that that's where we're going. So just keep an eye on those 1-minute charts or any new targets developing. TTF also down quite sharply, and we saw yesterday gradual deterioration, another move at the opening. Again, on the 1-minute chart on TTF, we've got targets of 24.65, 25.20, 25.60. So quite key there as well. And if we look at German gas, yesterday fell quite heavily, downside targets 3% lower, and Italian gas also, as you might expect, downside targets lower, 3%, 4%, and 6% lower. So we are seeing a lot of downside potential there. German power down just under 1% this morning at 52.09. That's really changed the picture quite significantly on this medium-term chart. We're now getting on the 60-minute chart downside targets 1 to 47.38, 9% downside. It is the only target to that level. Another one to 51.64, and we've got some upside targets too. So it's a bit of a mixed picture because of this sideways move that we've seen in the last week or so. And of course, we are in this pattern here. If we look at the daily chart, this shows through more clearly. We're almost like a triangle pattern closing in. Are we going to see this as a continuation where we go higher, or are we going to fall away? Correlation with crude is quite strong. That means at the moment that any moves in the crude price are probably going to have an impact on German power as well. So quite key there. If we look at the 1-minute chart, we do have a downside target in train at the moment of €50.40. So that's the one to keep an eye on as well. Taking a look at French power, looking slightly bearish here. Not quite as clear cut as the German power one. Of course, we've got more liquidity, and again on Trayport you'll have more liquidity as well. Looking at Polish power, this one coming from the exchange this morning, has had some quite good upside targets, but we've got now a new downside target, some 2.8% lower. Market's really just been affected by the general sentiment and those gas prices just pushing everything down. Crude oil not helping as well. That's it for today. Until tomorrow, happy charting. See you then.